So I'll take us back in time about a decade, and I want to talk about the kind of expectations that a lot of people had about what the accession process would do to the new members, and whether those were fulfilled or not. And even though I'm from Michigan, I promise you there won't be any public opinion data in this presentation, not even ESS. Okay. See, already we have problems with some bizarre spacing. Okay, so back in 2004, before the accession happened of the 10 new members, there's a general impression that the candidates were very keen on being members, but they were woefully underprepared for actual EU membership. And there's sort of two different stories that are being spun. And I certainly was, part of the problem, so I was one of the guilty parties. The first of which was that given this enormous elite consensus in the candidate countries about the sort of advisability and the sort of attractiveness of EU membership, what we'll see is a populist backlash. That basically there are populist parties of the kinds that Radek just mentioned in Poland, that just as the dip in support for democracy and for the EU really takes place in 2004, will then basically capitalize on this disappointment, on the fact that no parties are really questioning the accession process. And what we should see, therefore, after accession is a giant populist backlash against both mainstream party consensus on the EU and sort of the what is oftentimes perceived as a very unilateral and rough process of EU accession. The second expectation was basically that once the accession is over, what we should also see is a lot of institutional backsliding. That basically there are all these Potemkin institutions in the candidate countries, dutifully erected for the sake of joining the EU, and then as soon as they're in the EU, they'll basically just let all of that slide back and not enforce or continue to implement them. And so to give away the story, I'll claim that yes, what we see is both populism and institutional reversals, but the causes are not likely to be just the EU, nor in fact the economic crises of the late 2000s either. That instead, what really is to blame here is a continuing pattern of elite contestation in East Central Europe over state rents and institutions, rather than over constituencies and policy. So at best, the EU will have an interactive effect with domestic politics, but it's domestic politics that really trump any outside effects. So first, what about the populist backlash? Did this actually happen, and what did it look like? Well, the first thing to note, there's enormous variation, both within the regions and over time, in support for populist parties. This is not a new phenomenon in the sense that it's not just the new member countries that experience these wide rates of electoral support. And here, as we'll see, the EU basically, at most, makes visible existing patterns and exacerbates them rather than actually affecting them. So this is the electoral support for populist parties in the old EU, sort of the pre-2004 member countries. And as you can see, there's a general pattern of a rise, but it stays basically between 0 and 20% for the most part. The new EU looks like an even more of a multicolored spaghetti junction, with basically support rising and at higher rates over the course of this time. But there's enormous, again, in both the old and new Europe, and I'm going to use these as a kind of an offensive shorthand throughout this talk, there's enormous variation in these patterns. There's no simple sort of pattern that appears that distinguishes the two. Moreover, so what we basically see is that populism is on the rise in both new and old Europe. At the same time, however, new members show consistently higher rates of support for populist parties, both before and after the accession. So if we sort of, rather than looking at the individual countries, look at patterns of populist support in the country, in the regions. What you see basically is, the old member average, which goes, from roughly 0% in 1965 and rises to about 14%, 15% in 2010, versus the new member average, which basically already starts at a much higher rate, around 16%, and climbs as high as 32%. And of course, this 32% in 2010 is driven by some pretty significant outliers, like Slovakia, Hungary, Bulgaria, and others. Now, the final piece of evidence here is about what the accession itself does to support for populists. And it turns out that in both the old and the new member countries, support for populist parties roughly doubles after these countries accede to the European Union. So in the new Europe, it goes from roughly 17% to 32%. In the old, from about 2.5% to 6%. And if we just average this out, it's basically a rough doubling of support for populist parties. Now, is this caused by the EU, or is this simply caused by this global rise in populist parties? That's the question that I don't fully answer in either the paper or the presentation, but hope to in the future. And a final piece of evidence here about the sort of the strange patterns of populist support are the most recent European Parliament elections. And here, the big upsurge in sort of Eurosceptic or right-wing parties is all in the old Europe, right? It's France, the UK, and Denmark. In the new members, you don't see any such upsurge. The party that basically does the best is the KNP in Poland, which goes from 1.5% to 7%. And possibly Order and Justice in Lithuania. But there are no new sort of populist or right-wing upsurge parties, certainly in the new Europe. So when it comes to this evidence of a populist backlash that was expected to basically occur after accession, it's really unclear that there's this EU backlash. And even if there is, it's not just in the new members. The first thing we see is this enormous domestic variation across countries. So it can't be the case that simply EU membership or EU accession has a straightforward independent effect. And there's steady growth over time. Secondly, the higher support for populists in the new Europe predates accession. And this suggests that at best, EU membership has an interaction effect with domestic politics that are the real drivers of support for populism. And the same story holds if we look at institutional backsliding. The initial analyses were relatively sanguine. The basic idea that emerged is that the transposition record of various EU regulations and EU-mandated institutions was excellent, but the implementation was far less so. But here, we can't just simply attribute this to either the populists basically dismantling the state, or to some kind of a backlash against the EU-mandated regulations. Instead, there are two pieces of evidence here that suggest that something else is going on. The first of this is that the backsliding, and I sort of go in greater length in the paper about where we see this backsliding, but that's going to be saved for Monday for Laszlo's workshop. So where we do see the backsliding, it's not uniform. In fact, it appears to be highly self-serving as far as governing incumbents are concerned. Because where it occurs is in places like electoral laws, the dismantling of anti-corruption agencies, the removal of monitoring and oversight, of independent accounting, of all the kind of things that would otherwise put a stop to the highly lucrative business of controlling the state in East Central Europe. Those are the sectors that get dismantled. Those are the ones where we see institutional backsliding. In other sectors, like trade, the internal market, even the environment, those are all left alone because they're simply not as lucrative to the incumbents. And so once again, it's not that there's some kind of an anti-EU institutional backsliding that's going on. There's a much more finely nuanced process of basically, again, domestic drivers and domestic self-interest driving these patterns. And what I would suggest, what that really drives both the populist, the sort of steady rise in populism, and the patterns we observe of institutional dismantling, is a failure of representation. The mainstream parties basically have to countenance and, in fact, themselves enforce a great deal of electoral volatility. There's an enormous amount of disorganization, I can't even say it, it's so bad. A great deal of disorganization within the parties. And they tend to present sort of a common set of policies that don't really distinguish themselves very well at any points. And as Radek and others have shown, the electorates are very much, can clearly have crystallized by this point. And you can clearly distinguish electoral preferences. It's just that a lot of times parties don't happen to address them. Instead of competing over these constituencies, and instead of competing over policy, what political elites in East Central Europe, and of course, I use this as a shorthand, there's wide variation within the countries. What they instead compete over are state resources and state institutions. What we still see are all these patterns of basically trying to either take resources out of the state or dismantle and rebuild institutions to favor the incumbents. And it's the competition over these rents that drives sort of, basically elite contestation rather than competition over constituencies. And the result, of course, of this is a widespread disappointment with political parties. This is part of the reason why democracy is so poorly evaluated in East Central Europe, because it doesn't, the kind of contestation and representation that Dahl suggests are the mainstays of representative democracy aren't seen. Instead, these patterns of elite competition generate opportunities for populists to channel that great disappointment with what elite competition is doing. And they also, of course, offer precious few incentives for further state building or for building up state institutions. But the general sort of observation that I want to walk away with is that this is really not some kind of an EU backlash or a post-EU accession backsliding. Rather, this is a reassertion of a status quo ante, of basically what was happening before 2004. And the period of accession may have been this brief blip of both a greatly lowered support for democracy and of sort of these Potemkin institutions. But what we see basically is a return to these familiar patterns. And so the patterns of elite contestation, rather than of EU accession, explain both the rise in populist voting and the patterns of institutional backsliding that we observe. And at best, this is an interaction with EU accession. EU accession made a lot of these processes more visible and may have accentuated them, but it's certainly not to be held responsible for what we observe. And instead, basically, what we see instead is a continued pattern of elite competition that's pretty much unanchored by durable commitments to constituencies or institutions. And on that bleak note,